Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for waking up so early in the morning to come out and attend this event. We have a superb lineup of presentations this morning, and I know that everyone's going to leave here inspired, motivated, and most importantly, you're going to have something that you can go and do to improve your business, which is really what we are for today. For those of you that haven't met me before, my name is Andrew Patricio. I'm one of the founders of bizlaunch.com, a great resource for small business. And I'd really like to thank Yellowpages for supporting small business by running this event. So I encourage you to speak to them during the event. I encourage you to contact them and to ask them a couple of questions. We've got a really exciting lineup today, and I think every single one of us are going to learn a whole lot of things. For those people that are online, I encourage you as we go through the presentation to ask questions. And as we go through the presentation, I'll deal with some of these questions. So let me just go through the agenda. So what we're going to have three presenters. We're going to start off with Leonard Brody doing a presentation, and I'll read a little bit about him now. Then we're going to move to Tracy Smith, that's going to speak about online marketing. And then we have Bill Barnes. What we're going to do at the end, we're going to have the closing remarks at 10:25, and then we'll end the webcast at 10:30, and then it'll give us the opportunity for us that are at the live event to network with people. So let me start off by introducing our first speaker. So our first speaker this morning is Leonard Brody. Leonard Brody has been called a controversial leader of the New World Order and was recently named one of Canada's top 40 under 40. He's a highly respected entrepreneur, a venture capitalist, and best-selling author and two-time Emmy-nominated media visionary. He's helped in raising millions of dollars for startup companies, been through one of the largest internet IPOs in history, and has been involved in building, financing, and the sale of 5 companies to date. Much critical acclaim has followed him in his endeavors at Onvia, where he was part of the initial executive. The company was voted Canada's #1 startup. And if people are involved in startup, I'm always excited, in 2000, and subsequently closed $240 million IPO on the NASDAQ. In 2004, Leonard co-founded and was CEO of NowPublic.com, which is a pioneer in the field of citizen journalism. The company was named by Time magazine as one of the top 50 websites in the world. He was inducted into the museum in Washington, and the company was recently acquired by the Anschutz Corporation. Currently, Leonard sits as the president of Clarity Digital Group. He's responsible for overseeing one of the largest online news conglomerates in the world, including the Examiner.com, Now Public, which between them share over 25 million unique visitors per month and over 300,000 contributors. So he's one of the proud owners of the Coventry City Football Club in England. And Leonard holds an Honours Bachelor's of Arts from the Queen's University and a law degree from the Osgood Hall. He's a graduate of private equity course at the Harvard Business School, and most importantly, an entrepreneur. So welcome Leonard up on stage, and let him come and inspire us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks. Morning. You guys, can you hear me okay in the back? Seeing me is a problem. I can't help you there, but you can hear me fine in the back? Okay, great. So firstly, but before I start, these events are a lot of work and very complicated, and as Andrew said, I really want to make sure we thank Annie and Anne-Marie and Andrew and the rest of the team for putting this together, everyone. So thank you. I'm done. I'll see you later. No. So here's what I was hoping to do with you this morning in a short amount of time, enough that we can get questions sorted out. I think what you want to remember going forward is that we are at a very unique time historically. I'm going to move that a bit closer to my mouth. Better? There we go. When you look now and you stand as somebody who's running a small business, the era of the 5-year plan is basically a joke. It's effectively dead. If you think about 2 years ago, you probably weren't thinking a lot about Twitter. You probably weren't thinking that much about Facebook. And in truth, Groupon was probably somewhat unknown to you 2 years ago. So much will change in the next 12 to 24 months that it's probably best and brightest to take your time to look only at the next 365 days. That's pretty much about the visibility you're going to have into change, both technologically, customer change, macroeconomic change. The whole era that we were trained into around 5-year plans really, truly is dead. So what I wanted to do was sort of give you a bit of a window into where I think your life is going to be, where your business is going to be, and where you will likely be spending your time simply as a human being over the next 365 days. Now, that is a fork in the road. We have actually hit this incredible fork in the road as human beings. We're at this place now where if you stand on the one, if you're in the middle, forget about being a business person, forget about being somebody who's interested in media or technology. Just think about yourself as a person, as a parent, as a friend. On the one hand, you stand and you look at this enormous financial change that's gone on in the last 2 years. In 2008, we witnessed what was probably the worst financial meltdown since the Depression, if not worse than the Depression itself. You stand at that road and you look down another path and you see incredible environmental change. So we are now, as you know, standing at a point in time where the Earth's core temperature is the hottest it's been since the melting of the polar ice caps. About a year ago, a piece of the North Pole actually broke off the size of Manhattan, one of the biggest breakages we have seen ever historically in recorded history. So you've got this incredible amount of change happening in our planet. Then you look a little bit more to the right, and you see incredible technological change. And not just technological in the sense of just bits and bytes, but actual information change. So we have now statistically produced more data as human beings and more information in the last 3 years, 36 months, than we did in the prior 5,000. That rate will continue to double over a period of time over the next 5 years. So we will inevitably produce more data in a period of 2 months than we will in the preceding 4,000 to 5,000 years. Then you take a look just one more bit to the right at this fork in the road, and you will see incredible demographic change. So all of a sudden, we went from being somewhat predictable, the age brackets being somewhat alike, generally speaking, in a behavioral sense, to having enormous swelling at both ends of the pendulum of demographics. So on the one hand, you have the graduation, so to speak, of the baby boom. And then you have, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, Gen Ys and millennials, who for many of you that have kids in that age demographic know they are complete and utter aliens. But the truth is, completely the same in some respects, in terms of the values that they share, and in other respects they are unidentifiable to one another. So you stand as a human being at this fork in the road, you see this huge financial change, enormous environmental change, huge information and technology overload, incredible shifts in who we are as people demographically, and it is really easy to understand why we are confused. I'm allowed to show this here, by the way. I actually live in the States now, so I don't get to bring this out as often as I would like, but here we go, for your Canadian pleasure. But it is easy to figure out why people are confused. This is an incredible, if you weren't confused living in 2011, you wouldn't be living in 2011. This is an incredibly complicated time in history, one that's quite distinct and unique compared to any other place we've been to as human beings before. And what I want to do to that end this morning is walk you through a little bit of historical context. I think it is very, very poor form when people don't spend time thinking about where we've been in order to understand where we are. You just can't do it. And when it comes to the web and it comes to social media or it comes to sheer macroeconomics, the historical context of how we got here is really, really important to understanding what you do from this day forward. The other thing I want to do is talk about human behavior. Human behavior is a very, very traditionally static thing. For about 4,000 years, human beings changed very little in their behavior. There were some exceptions to that. There were some blips on the radar. You would have, for example, during the advent of television, there was slight changes in human behavior, meaning what you did after dinner, but not that much. Traditionally, what happened for about a 4,000-year period was institutions would drive human behavior. So governments would drive human behavior. Education, systems, and eras would drive behavior. Most of the behavior that you are now governed by, whether it's the education system, how we govern ourselves through democracy, how you get a promotion at work when you move from grade 1 to grade 2, is governed by the Industrial Revolution. That revolution dictates much of the standard. In fact, you can thank Henry Ford for the most part. The concept of standardization was really, really put in place in the Industrial Revolution based on concepts of what we wanted human behavior to be. What happened, arguably, in the last 15 years of the commercialized internet is human behavior has changed more than at any other point in human history. And it's important, I think, going forward to understand that all of this, all of the discussions about technology are irrelevant. Because there's always been really good enabling technology that allows people to do what they want to do. The question was, people weren't using it, and why? A lot of the stuff, in fact, today, if you take a look at companies that are quite successful today, in 90% of the cases, they are Me Too businesses. They are businesses that existed well long ago, 10, 15 years ago. Groupon is a great example of that, by the way. Groupon is a 10-year-old concept that started out of a company in Seattle called Mercata in the 1990s. Paul Allen spent about $90 million trying to prove that Groupon would work. The problem wasn't the technology or the model. It was around human behavior and the willingness and ability to adopt that change. So I want to walk you through what I think is the most important thing to know in the next 365 days, which is the changes in human currency that have gone on, which make us completely different people than we were 15 years ago. I also want to talk to you a little bit about where we're going. As small business, I always hated the term small business, to be honest, but as entrepreneurs, as people who are running companies, what I think you need to pay attention to over the next 365 days, things that are going to be really important in not only running your business, but in just being here, being present, living in this world every day. Then I'll talk a little bit about how you prepare for those 365 days, and I think we'll have enough time, we'll get to questions that I will be able to show you my bar mitzvah video. And here's a little preview. Look at that. Stefan, do you see that? It's me becoming a man before your very eyes at the age of 13. I still have that suit, by the way. So let's get started. Let me talk for a minute about social media, and really social media is just a ruse for the internet generally. So I think, quite frankly, terms like social media and Web 2.0 and Web 3.0, all of this stuff is just garbage. It doesn't mean anything. It's just people trying to put labels on a very specific change that has gone on in human behavior, which technology has managed to match, right? If you don't have the two matching, there are so many eras in history where the technology was clearly available and clearly worked, but the behavior wasn't there yet. And so it just didn't match. You need, in order to have a Skype or in order to have a Facebook, you need behavior and you need technological implementation. Without the two, you get Friendster, for those of you that remember. So now, we're at this sort of place where people are kind of a little bit wigged out about social media, and they tend to focus a little bit too much on the wrong questions. They tend to focus a lot on the how. And by the way, you're going to hear two very excellent presentations today about the how you do it, how you engage in it, what are the sort of ins and outs of engaging in both SEO, SEM, social media, the sort of take, you want to walk away with the hardcore question that every business person wants to know, which is, how do I do this? How do I engage? But I don't want to talk to you about that, because there's much smarter people that will talk to you about it later. What I care about is the why. We don't spend enough time as entrepreneurs thinking about why this matters. Why does the web matter? And it's not because it's a big audience and it's supposedly cheap and it allows you freedom. Those aren't the reasons why it matters. The web, and by the way, when I say web, I'm using both the mobile web and the wired web in the same context. The web matters for two fundamentally big reasons historically, and the reasons that you really should care about. The first is a technological reason. If you go back over the last 350 years and look at the media evolution, some would say revolution, depending on that particular media, we've had four big movements in human communication. The first was the Gutenberg movable type. The second was transmission through wire, telegraph, telegram. The third was recorded media. So could have been CDs, tapes. In that day, it was obviously Victoria phone. And the fourth was television. These were the four big media movements, communication revolutions that happened over the last 250 years. Maybe a bit longer, maybe 275 to 300. They all share two very distinctly common attributes. The first is every one of them was either a one-to-many or a one-to-one communications mechanism. The second thing they shared, which was also interesting, was that in order to actually participate in this, required incredibly expensive equipment and often a government license. So you couldn't just get up and start your own recording studio. You couldn't just get up and start your own newspaper, because probably one, you didn't have the cash, and two, you probably needed some form of a government license to get engaged in it in the first place. What was unique about the internet as the fifth revolution is exactly what you're looking at now. How many of you have seen this before, by the way? I'd just be curious. So a few of you. So what you're looking at is an experiment that was done on an hour, a 60-minute period on Facebook in December 2010 that shows the mapping of lifetime human relationships within that hour across the planet. The difference between the internet technologically, the thing you need to remember about why this matters, is the first time in history where human beings could communicate on a many-to-many basis. Millions of people speaking to millions of people without any expensive intermediary or government in between them. From a technological and historical standpoint, that is why this matters. We have never, ever been here before where this kind of mechanism allowed us to get out of our own way when we speak to one another. And you can see just by the nature of the movement of this communication, there was never a point in the history of humanity where you could have taken a snapshot, and this is, by the way, not the general internet, this is simply Facebook, let alone what else is going on the web, where you would have seen this kind of human communication and interrelatedness between each other in that short a period of time ever in humanity. The second reason why this whole movement matters is because of technology, and some people would argue that it's a chicken and egg thing. Frankly, it doesn't really matter. We have changed more as human beings in the last 15 years than at any other point in human history. You are virtually unrecognizable as a human compared to the person you were 15 years ago. Because of that, we're not only not the same people that we used to be, we actually don't fit in here anymore. We are stuck in a world that was designed around the principles of standardization out of the Industrial Revolution with a bunch of people that are highly pixelated and highly personalized that don't fit in to the model anymore the way it's been set out. We actually are misfits in our own world. But this one factor, this one change in human behavior, is why everybody should spend an incredible amount of time thinking not only about the how, but the why. And the why is because you are not the same people you were 15 years ago. And by the way, that's pan-generationally. That change has nothing to do with how old you are. The largest growth demographic on Facebook is women over the age of 45. That is the fastest growing demographic on Facebook by a factor of about 10. Remember this? This has nothing to do with my presentation, by the way, but how proud are you to be a Canadian now? Huh? Just look at that. Let's give him a round of applause. So, I just like looking at it. If you don't believe me that we've changed behaviorally over the last 10 years, think about this moment. Sorry, guys, this mic is moving around a bit. So, think about when Sidney Crosby scored this goal, where you were sitting, who you were with, and think about the other preeminent moment in hockey in our history, which was 1972. Paul Henderson scores the goal, beats the Soviet Union. Let me show you for a second this event. Think about where you were in February 2010, and let me show you what this event looked like on Facebook. Here, between 2:30 and 3 o'clock, here's where Zach Parise ties the game for the United States. Here is where Sidney Crosby scores the winning goal. What you are looking at is Canada's gold medal half an hour as it looked like on Facebook. Between 2:30 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 3.5 million Canadians shared status updates about this game on Facebook, just on Facebook. So there were probably millions elsewhere between Twitter and other areas that people shared. The question was, who were these people? And as we drilled down into it, again, the vast majority of the growth of this 3.5 million Canadians that were participating in this were women over the age of 40. So why does this matter? Think about 1972. How many of you watched that game in 1972? Probably should admit that. It was a bit of a trick question. And anyway, I was but a young lad at the time. If you think about when Paul Henderson scored that goal, how you shared that with the people around you. In 1972, you probably sat in your living room, hugged the person beside you, or if you were in a bar, did the same. You might have picked up the phone and called one or two people, but you certainly didn't do this. And even if you could create some sort of counter-inflationary measure that measured one status update was worth, one phone call in 1972 was worth 300 status updates on Twitter, whatever the counter-inflationary measure would be, you still didn't get on the phone in 1972 and phone 100 people. There is clearly a behavioral shift in how we live our lives now and how we expect to share the events in our lives that matter, statistically speaking. Because when you talk about this with an economist, they would come back and say, well, the technology didn't exist to do that then. Well, actually it did. The telephone existed, and it was very easy to pick up the telephone and call multiple people. And as I said, you could very clearly say that even if one phone call was worth 1,000 status updates on Facebook, the two still don't map. We are way more active in our behavior as human beings in sharing the events of our lives. It's almost an expectation that the events, which used to have a very immediate impact in us, now have a very broad spread shared impact, often across the planet. We are clearly today living historians. Today, you are living in one of the most impactful, if not the most impactful revolution in human history. What we are living in today will make the Industrial Revolution, the Mesozoic era, look like nothing. And you are it. You are living in it now. And the problem in living in it is it has no name. That goes to the spoils of the historians. And we still don't quite know where this is all going to end. But be cautiously aware that we are living now in an era that 200 years from now, historians will clearly write as the most significant, forget about the technology, the most significant in human behavior, the most significant in the geography of our planet, the makeup and change in religion. All of this, we are at a fundamental boiling point, and you are living in it right now. Let me give you an example of what that means. If you asked any other historian what the most significant moment in human history was, with the exception of the advent of religion, take that out of the equation, most historians would point to the 200-year period between 1745 and 1945. And they would say it because in that time you had the Industrial Revolution, the Great Depression, and 2 world wars. Fundamentally in 200 years. If you fast forward to today, in what I would call the pixelated revolution, although who knows what it'll be called 200 years from now, we have experienced the shrinkage of time. What we experienced in those 200 to 250 years in that other period of history, we have fundamentally experienced in 15 to 17 now. So starting from 1993, which I would argue was the beginning of the commercialized internet, to 2011, we have seen the pixelated revolution whose impact will be far greater than industrialization, far greater. We have seen the financial meltdown in 2008, which now economists are at least admitting was probably worse than what happened in 1929 for many reasons. And from a war perspective, we've been very fortunate to avoid a third world war. But if you look at the regional conflict from Rwanda to Sudan to what's happening, it happened in Somalia, Bosnia, all of the areas around the world where regional conflict flared, although the actual numbers don't match in terms of the number of people affected and dead, the impact on the planet is about the same. In 1945, there were roughly 65 countries in the world. Today, because of these regional conflicts and change, there are now 194. 95, I think, actually, now with Kosovo. So we went from tripling the planet in terms of our geography and how we organize ourselves culturally and physically. So we went from what was a 200-year period and shrunk functionally the same stuff into a 17-year period. Time is very much shrinking on us in this era. Now let me talk about behavior for a second, because what I said, which I really do want to make sure you understand, is that in the last 15 years, as human beings, we have changed fundamentally more than at any other point in human history. For one reason. In and around, this is for the Star Wars nerds in the crowd, in and around 1993, science fiction caught up with human beings. For years, science fiction writers had talked about the division of yourself. They would often sometimes refer to them as demons or people who followed you around that were part of your identity, an extension of yourself. What happened when the commercialized internet began, and we're only now starting to figure that out, is you as human beings pan-generationally split. You have a digital and a virtual self and a physical self. And by virtual self, I don't mean an avatar or something that you play in an online game. I mean your personality, your behavior in your virtual identity is significantly different of that in your physical world. What's interesting is almost nobody paid attention to that until about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, when sociologists realized, in fact, we are fundamentally different people. And one of the key characteristics of your virtual self, your virtual identity, is you're significantly younger than your physical identity. We are, for the most part, children, at best adolescents, in our virtual self. Why does it matter? It matters because the average Westerner spends more time interacting with other people in their virtual selves than you do in your physical one. So if you don't understand the virtual identity and the virtual self, you will consistently continue to make mistakes by taking, if you use marketing as a great example. Marketing online has continued to be a challenge because we have taken effectively a physical self approach trying to speak to people in their virtual identities, and it doesn't work. It doesn't match. One of the interesting things, by the way, about Facebook to keep in mind, Facebook is extremely powerful because it actually forced your physical and your virtual identities to somewhat merge. See, prior to Facebook, if you were on AOL or Yahoo, you could be, Loverboy698 or whatever. It didn't really matter, whatever you were. Now, in order for Facebook to work effectively, you actually need to have a physical identity related to that virtual self. So we're seeing in the Facebook environment those two worlds collide, but really make no mistake, we are very, very young in our virtual identities and our virtual selves. And I'll give you some examples of that. The first is around citizenship. Facebook today is 700 million members. If it was a country, it would be the third largest country on the planet. And in some respects, if you are in your virtual self, it is a country. And to think of Facebook as a nation with its own mores and norms is quite accurate. In your virtual identity, your nationhood, your citizenship is very different than it is in the physical world. And in some respects, your physical citizenship is far less relevant. Your concept of nationality is far less relevant. It's not irrelevant, it's just less relevant in your virtual self than it is in your physical one. Let me talk about trust for a minute. This is one of the areas that is the most important difference between the virtual and the physical self. You are way more trusting in your virtual identity than you are in your physical one. Way more. And my father, who is a 74-year-old dentist and not exactly technically sophisticated, I try to get this home to him all the time, and I finally found the analogy that worked, which is this. I said, Dad, when I was a baby, would you have posted photographs, my baby photos, on the lamppost in our neighborhood? He said, of course not. Why would I do that? There's freaks in there. I wouldn't do that. I don't want these people seeing your photos. Then why do you post hundreds of photographs of your granddaughter on Flickr, Facebook, which are openly searchable global lampposts? Blank. No idea. And the answer we're learning is trust. You are, in fact, far more trusting, far more naive, hedonistic in your virtual identity than you are in your physical one, which is why breaches of brand in the virtual world can be so much more impactful than they can in the physical one, because you're speaking to children, truthfully. When you are online and you're speaking to people in their virtual self and you breach trust, it is the physical world equivalent of marketing cigarettes to children. You're breaching a very, very trusting individual that will have long-term lasting impact as their virtual selves evolve, but also in a more complicated way in their physical behaviors in the physical world. So we have to accept this duality of self. It will continue to evolve quite differently over the next 10 years, but it's important to think of that currency as very different. And as I said to my dad, at least in our neighborhood, we knew who the freaks were. Here, you don't have a clue. Think of it, by the way, in terms of shopping. This is another good analogy. If you think about the data you give about yourself online compared to a physical situation, it's almost laughable. Can you imagine if you walked into the Bay, you're checking out, and they said, Mr. Brody, can I have your password, please? And your shipping residence, and your home residence. How did you hear about us? You'd be like, seriously, shut up, I gotta go. You wouldn't even think about it. You would not think that that would be acceptable in a physical context. Yet in the virtual context, it's completely acceptable because of this. Now, it may not always be that way, but just remember that that trust factor is really, really critical in the virtual world. Relationships. This is somebody's poor kid. Let me explain another really important part of the virtual identity. Relationships are very different in the virtual world than they are physically. And it's it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine when people try to constantly force the two as if they're the same thing. They're not. And you'll often hear people joke about, oh, you got 1,000 friends on Facebook. Aren't you great? Like, how many of them do you really know? And it's like, your Facebook list is not the invite list for your wedding. They're very different things. And what we're learning is that the old sociological theory of human relationships was led by one guy. Do you know who Roger Dunbar is? Have you heard that name? So Roger Dunbar was a sociologist at Oxford University who came to the conclusion, which was, by the way, the governing thought around human relationship for 100 years, that human beings could not manage more than 150 relationships. It's impossible. You ask my family, they'll tell you I can't manage 5. The truth is, that theory was very critically flawed and restricted to the physical world, if it was true at all. In the virtual identity, what technology allowed you to do was to create what many people, including Malcolm Gladwell, have called weak links or tertiary ties. So the question is, do they matter? Does it matter if you have 5,000 friends on Facebook? Does it matter if you have 6,000 connections on LinkedIn? And the answer is, statistically speaking, yes. Fundamentally. Most of the research on this is now coming out of Stanford University, and what we're seeing is that search, when you started, as the internet was in its commercial infancy and search became the main discovery tool for people online, that in fact, the larger, not just the qualitative, but the larger your social graph is online, the better off and more secure you're going to be as a person. You're going to have better news and information, better access to job opportunities and wealth, and you'll be more informed. Why? Because as data continues to proliferate, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, your social graph becomes an incredibly important filter for the information that you get. So as that news and information comes through that filter, the greater the size of the filter, we see statistically the better off you are in your own life. So when somebody makes fun of you for having 2,000 Facebook friends, you can rest assured you are doing the right thing. It really does matter. And what search was in the mid to late 90s in discovery on the internet, social will become over the next 2 to 3 years. Let me talk about something else, which is the generations. Because everything I've talked about now has been about behavior, and it really does apply across generations. There is one little distinct difference. So Gen Ys and the millennials, people born 1981 and after, again, if you have children, you know what I'm talking about. They are absolutely not of this world. There is a fundamental difference, and it's important to be aware. What you are looking at is, although it's not the most accurate data in the world because it's been time averaged, you are looking at a sample study that was done on the heat mapping of the human brain between Gen Y on your left and the millennials and Gen X on your right. What they did was they brought a huge amount of data in the same time, multi-channel data, into the minds of these two generations and mapped what happened. And what we realized in Gen Ys and millennials is that, in fact, they are superior human beings. And by a long shot, by the way. And it's not a mystery as to why that's the case. My generation, Gen X, was the first transitional era. We were 1 foot in the old world and 1 foot in the new. So we still read newspapers, but we still carried iPads. We still listened to music on DVDs and CDs, but we still did it digitally. This generation is the first generation 2 feet fully out. They do not speak the same language. They don't shop the same way. They don't consume data the same way. If my 13-year-old nephew is sitting where you're sitting and wants to talk to me, he'll text me. And if I speak to him back, I've pulled the plug on him. He doesn't even know how to communicate. And by the way, I'm not saying that's good or bad. Really, quite frankly, it's irrelevant whether it's good or bad. It just is what it is. And what I would recommend is take a look at the superior nature of multitasking and multi-channel capability of this generation. When given multiple inputs of data, you can see on the right that my generation was effectively Homer Simpson. We couldn't handle the multitasking. So the old adage about human beings typically use about 10% of their brainwave capacity, we will find out more and more about that in this generation over the next little while. So it's important to remember that, quite frankly, this generation is faster and much more capable of dealing on a multi-channel environment than we are or ever were. Why? Again, it's not because suddenly we were eating different foods. It's because this generation was the first generation born into devices. The average North American child, the first thing they see when they're born is a machine. Their first really solid toy that they engage with outside of birth, beyond just being an absolute baby, is typically a machine. So they're much more sophisticated at multi-channel communication, much more sophisticated at understanding problem solving than we will ever be. Remember the island of misfit toys? It's exactly where we are today. We are misfits in our own world. If you look at everything, I said this earlier, education, government, schools, how you handle marketing and HR, are all based on Industrial Revolution concepts that do not fit the people who live in this world anymore. Take a look at government. I'll just give you one thing to think about. Representative democracy, which is the system in which we just lived on May 2nd, is based on a technological assumption that is no longer true. We have representatives in government. Some political theorists would argue for other reasons, but from a traditional perspective, we have representatives in government because you couldn't take 30,000 people from a riding and effectively poll them and come with an answer. That's not the case today. It's not true. So most of what you do doesn't fit the people who live in it anymore. And why is that an issue? Because as much as the environment is a pressing concern for all of us, we are living in a pressure cooker where consistently the institutions we live in are breaking down under our feet. Look at the United States, by the way. 36% of American high school students will drop out this year. Over a third. Is it because these kids are stupid or lazy? No. It's because you're asking them to put on a pair of pants that don't fit anymore. It doesn't make sense. The institution doesn't make sense. And let me give you an example of that. I walked into a classroom in the United States, and it's exactly the same here. And these kids were memorizing the times table. Memorizing the times table. And I was like, in what moment in your life will you not have a calculator within 3 seconds of reach? And I don't mean it's not important to understand math and understand the implementation of math and the methodology and the theory, but to memorize the times table. Really? Is that really important anymore? And I know that every other kid in that class, every 2 seconds was looking down at their iPhone or their watch, and they're like, I don't need to know that. This tells me that. I don't need to figure that out. And then you talk to teachers about that, and you say, why do we teach kids the multiplication table to memorize it? I'm like, well, it's very important. I'm like, but in what instance wouldn't they have an iPhone in their pocket or something that they could do it right away? And they start to, like, the wires start to come undone. They're like, well, what if they were on a desert island? I'm like, good question. I guess the coconut counting will be a little bit slower. But the truth is, it's just a very, very small example of the kinds of things that don't fit the people who live in them anymore, from government to education. And why I said we're reaching a boiling point, what you experienced in Egypt and Tunisia and Yemen and Syria is not just about dissatisfaction with the way people live. It is about a fundamental misfit, started and kicked off by this man. The entire refacing of the Middle East, both geographically and religiously, happened because it hit a boiling point around the misfit theory. Mohammed Bouaziz was a produce vendor in Tunisia who was consistently harassed by the administration and government, and to prove a point, lit himself on fire and killed himself, which sparked, for all accounts, the boiling point, which brought us Tunisia, which brought us Egypt. And it wasn't because Twitter and all these other things existed to help it happen. It was because a boiling point happened. These boiling points will continue to occur over the next 5 years, where we see these misfit integrations reach critical mass. Now, I told you I'd end off a little bit by talking about where we're going, the kinds of things that I think you need to be aware of as not only an entrepreneur, but also just as a human being. And the first thing that I get asked all the time is, what is Web 3.0 and where is it going? The answer is Web 3.0 happened 18 months ago, and it doesn't really matter whether it's Web 2, Web 3, Web 15, highly irrelevant. What matters, I think, to understand about the future and the evolution of the internet is around human behavior. See, if you go back to what I said earlier, that we produce more data in the last few years than we did in the preceding 5,000, and that will continue to grow and multiply. The problem that you will face is there will be more data than any human being could possibly understand. Now remember, the human mind is finite. Computers are not. And Ray Kurzweil talks about that a lot, which is the computers will always get smarter than us and always have greater capacity because we can add chips on. We can't add chips on here yet. I'm sure we will, but not now. Semantic analysis, behavioral analysis on the internet is the exact computational equivalent of what I was talking about that happens in your virtual behavior. So where the internet is moving very clearly is to an era where it will take data about your behavior, churn it, watch you, and feed you back information that you care about in a way that you didn't probably know or couldn't have done on your own. So the first black and white television equivalent of that was search, right? Search was the equivalent of starting to look for things. And it's still, by the way, extremely helpful and extremely relevant and will be for a very long time. Where the behavioral and semantic analysis kicks in is when it starts to look at your behavior around other things you do. And if it sounds a little science fiction-y, let me give you 2 real examples of people who do it today very successfully. Your Facebook news feed is an example of semantic analysis. Facebook monitors your behavior. It monitors the friends' pages you visit on. So you'll notice that your news feed can change in 2 ways on Facebook. One is you can say, this person's important to me, let me know more about them. Or you'll find out, you can do a test, go on Facebook and take somebody's profile and consistently click on it, consistently look at their pictures, and you'll see within about 48 hours, any change from that person will start to appear prominent in your news feed. It's watching very closely around your behavior. The other great example, by the way, the one that's been doing this the longest, is Amazon. So Amazon sells 35 to 40% of its product, selling you stuff you didn't even know you wanted. And if you don't, it's sort of the internet equivalent of biggie sizing stuff, except it's based on behavior. And if you want to know how good it is, take this test. Next time you have a gift-giving occasion, go to your significant other and ask them to buy you a book on Amazon. When they buy the book and you open it, go to Amazon and see which book Amazon would have recommended for you and see who knows you better. Statistically speaking, by the way, 66 to 68% of the time, it will be Amazon. Will know you better than your significant other in terms of that behavior. So that, to me, is where the web is going. It is under this analysis of our behavior online that makes your experience and your pathway of navigating through this information much easier based on who you are and your needs. Let me talk about another big change which is really relevant for entrepreneurs. Remember the old Columbia record clubs and Columbia House? We are returning to that era. The last decade of the internet has been basically fixed on the large room era. It was all about largesse. 500 million, 300 million. Every time somebody talked about a company on the internet, it was all about their size. We are graduating out of the large room era of the internet into the small room era. The era which is being kicked off right now by a lot of private event-based sale companies like the Gilt Group, Votre Privé, One Kings Lane, companies like that where you have to be members to join. So you're going to see over the next 12 to 18 months a lot more exclusivity around specific groups and niches become more profitable, become more manageable from a cost build-out perspective, and frankly, more manageable from a timing perspective. These large rooms were very difficult to navigate often. The small room era will be monikered by close, tight understanding of your niches, your relationships, and what you care about. Let me talk about mobile for 1 minute. I think people underestimate just how explosive this is going to be in the next 2 years. To put this in perspective, today, depending on who you ask, there are anywhere from 700 to 750 computers on the planet. There are today, again, depending on who you ask, anywhere from 3 to 3.5 billion mobile phones. That number will grow to 4.5 billion mobile phones by the end of 2013. Most of those devices will have faster internet connectivity by the end of 2013 than your desktop or laptop will. So if you look at the behavioral change that's happened in 15 years, which is amazing historically, based on you being tethered to the internet, you can imagine how significantly that's going to change when that device is faster, in your pocket and on your person at all times, and knows exactly where you are. That will put jet fuel on another 5 years of incredible behavioral change. And you should spend a lot of time thinking about mobile and a lot of time not trying to distinguish the web between mobile and your desktop and laptop, and realize that this delivery vehicle is going to be hugely significant. Let me finish off by talking about the Microsoft era. In the late 90s, business was represented by the Microsoft era. It was all about functionality. So Microsoft made its money by building product that was really, really complicated and really function-rich. I mean, if you look at a Microsoft product from Windows to Office, they're incredibly intricate. There was just a bit of a problem with them, which is they didn't work properly, and they looked bad. So how does it happen that we've evolved from this Microsoft era to a company like Apple, which today has a $120 billion larger market cap than Microsoft, with significantly less of the technical sales audience? Apple today is about 6 to 8% of all computer sales, which means software because it's packaged with its own software. So how does a company like that, put aside the iPhone and the iPad, which is incredible, generate that kind of market cap lift over a company that's got 95% of the market share? And the answer is we are moving into the Apple era. What does it mean? Consumers are much smarter than they were 5 years ago. When they buy something, forget about technology for a minute, this is just merely representation. When people buy stuff today, they want to know that it does one or two things really well. They know why they bought it, and they want it to do what they asked it to do when they bought it. What we found with Microsoft is 90% of the users used less than 4% of the functionality. It didn't matter anymore that it could do a million different things because nobody used it and nobody cared. Secondly, it has to work. It has to turn on. Not turn on, then I take a shower, feed my kids, and then it's ready. It needs to turn on and work and be simple and elegant. User interface. If the 90s were portrayed by function and functionality, we're over that era as consumers. We now expect that the products we buy will do what they said they were going to do, and we don't want them to do too much. We just want them to do well what we bought it for. But we want that product to look elegant and the design of it to be elegant and be a part of our identity. And that's where Apple won the war. Apple won because when you carry an Apple device, it is part of your identity. And if you want a great example of that, look at the iPhone 4. The iPhone 4, 4 months before it was released, widespread and understood that that phone sucked. It didn't work. The antenna was in the wrong place. And if you have an iPhone 4 and you don't have a bumper on it, you hold it in your hand, you'll watch the bars go down. They just made a fundamental physics and math error. And yet people were lined up to buy it. Lined up. It was the biggest product event in Apple's history. Even after everyone knew it didn't work properly. Because the product was such a piece of these people's identity, it was so connected to who they were, and most importantly, it was beautiful. The design was incredible. So we are moving, and I would encourage you to think about this, especially as you work online and deal with people in their virtual selves. The virtual self is really interested in eye candy. It's really interested in design and function. Not like the old Microsoft era where it looked like a big clunker, but it had a lot of stuff that it did. And you're going to see design creep into very, very differing walks of life, like what you eat. UI and design around the clothing that you buy, around the dating life that you ensue. We care about data and how it's presented. Those are the companies that win. You look at all of the great product on the web today, it's simplistic and very beautiful and easy to look at. And I would encourage you, as much as you think about your businesses and how to market it, think about the design, think about the human interaction, and think about the virtual self. And let me end off on this point before I take questions. The internet was created as an unbreakable node. The whole purpose of the internet was if you took one node out of it, the rest of the nodes would continue to communicate without it. And we have behaviorally replicated that as human beings. We are effectively now a hacker culture. There is no wall anymore that we will not or have not overcome. Look at Libya and look at Tunisia. The Libyan government tried to shut communication down so that people couldn't get access to Twitter. So what did they do? Immediately, Libyans got on the phone, recorded audio messages to people in Canada who transcribed those messages on Twitter and worked around the node. Look at China. When the first earthquake happened in Shenzhen 4 years ago, it was 3 months before the rest of the world knew it happened. The last one that happened roughly a year ago was 30 minutes before the Chinese government knew about it. We are now in a culture of hackers where we control the nodes. And you will see, again, a lot of this traditional breakdown happen very, very quickly, and these boiling points happen very quickly. So look, I said I would end off by telling you how you prepare for these next 365 days. And the answer is, I have no idea. I really don't know. But what I do know is that we are not the same people that we used to be. And in order to succeed, it is not good enough to be good at business, and it is not good enough to understand your customer. It is important that you are permanent students of the human condition, because no one will be more successful. And Facebook and Apple and companies like this understand this to a T. The more you understand the differences in the human currency, how fundamentally distinct we are in our virtual identities from our physical self, the more successful you will be both long-term in your business and, frankly, in your own social and economic sphere. So on that note, I can tell you with everything that we're going through, although it's going to be rocky, this really is going to be one hell of a 365 days. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Andy.
Okay, so what we're going to be doing now is I'm going to get a couple of questions, but just to get it going, yeah, we're going to do a couple of. So just to get it going, I'm going to ask Leonard, as a small business owner, one of the biggest challenges we have is, what social media should we be embracing? I mean, should every single small business owner be using social media at the moment? That's the first one. And secondly, what do you see the small business of the future? I mean, what will he or she be doing, from a technology point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. with respect to social media, I mean, terms like social media and smartphones and Web 2.0, they're all kind of goofy and ridiculous. And like people talk about smartphones today, in 5 years, in 2 years, saying smartphone is going to be the equivalent of referring to the internet as the information superhighway. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So I wouldn't get caught up in a lot of the jargon about what stuff is or isn't. And I would and obviously it's very particular to the industry you're in and what you do, but the most important thing is pay attention to where your customers spend their time. Where do they live? And I'll give you an example of that. So I am an owner, one of the owners of a professional soccer team in England. And I am, to my knowledge anyway, the only director of a football league team that speaks to fans directly on Twitter. Now I know why. I am the only one doing it. But the reality is, at some point, we would sit in meetings and I would watch the fan forums and the representative groups, and they just weren't representative of the fans at all. And so we had to go meet them where they lived. And we had a very active population on Twitter that was talking about games and talking about where we were. And so I literally just injected myself in the conversation. And for a little while, it was a bit rocky. So I would encourage you, regardless of whether it's Facebook or Ren, I mean, if you sell in the market in China, you want to spend time on Renren or Yandex or other, there's huge properties that are all over the world. So I would just encourage you to do an incredible amount of research and find out where your customers live and where they spend their time, both physically and virtually, and make sure that you're in that place with them. So, and with respect to entrepreneurs, the best advice I ever got about being an entrepreneur had nothing to do with business at all. And the advice was simply this. Entrepreneurs spend way too much time thinking about the business problem they're solving and the solution, and not enough time about the thing they're solving for themselves and their own lives. And where, statistically speaking, the vast majority of small and medium-sized enterprise and entrepreneurial ventures fail is when there is a mismatch between what you're actually building and what you actually want in your own personal life. You need to ask very key questions. Do I want children? How much time do I want to spend with my kids? How much money do I really need? How much time do I want to spend on an airplane? How many people do I want reporting to me, realistically? Because what you'll find is that running a dry cleaning store is the same amount of work as running a chain of 300 of dry cleaning stores. You only have so many hours in the day. And it's just a matter of the kind of life you want to lead for yourself. And if you want a great example statistically of that, the average general fail rate for entrepreneurs is about 80 to 85%. However, if you look at first-time immigrants to this country in the United States, that fail rate goes down to about 35-40%. Why? Because if you asked 99% of the immigrant entrepreneurs in North America and said, why are you doing this? They would give you two answers. I want a roof over my head and my family, and I want to educate my children. And when the shit hits the fan and things are bad, it's pretty easy to stay on course when you're extremely focused about what the goals of the outcome of that business are supposed to be. And that's why the failure rates are so significantly low in immigrant businesses. So that, I think, is the best thing you can do, is map that to what you want to have in your own life, then figure out the business problem after that, once you figure out your own problem.
Okay, I get really excited when Leonard speaks about immigrants, because some of you may have noticed I have an accent. Anyway, so as we move forward, I'm going to ask one of the online questions so when it comes to small business specifically in Canada, do you think it's going to play a more important part or less important part in the future? I mean, do we see a future where everybody's a small business owner? Or an entrepreneur, if you want to use that word?
Yeah. So this is, by the way, one of the companies I helped build was called Onvia, and we focused exclusively on what we then called the small and mid-sized market. I would just prefer to call it as the entrepreneur market. But I will tell you this. In Canada, we are, again, unfortunately, consistently getting in our own way on this issue. So you've been sold a bill of goods as Canadians by many governments and many people spewing this myth, which is we need more billion-dollar companies in Canada. We need more RIMs. We need more Nortels. Actually, no, we don't. They're actually worse for the economy. In fact, for the last 40 years, 50 years, the vast majority of this country has been employed by companies that are under 40 employees. What we need is more of you. So we should be encouraging the growth. Yeah, it's true. So I was in a prior life, before I became a bit of a heretic within the government, I was one of the main advisors to David Emerson when he was Minister of International Trade, and made that very clear to him that the more we talk about building Nortels, we saw how well that ended up, and other companies that are billion-dollar companies, and telling Canadians they shouldn't sell their businesses is ridiculous. The reality is this country will and will always be built on the back and blood of small business and mid-size and entrepreneurs. And the more we encourage that and encourage those behaviors, the better off we'll be, the more Canadians will be employed, and the better off the wealth of this country will be on the global system. So I think, to me, it's the heartblood of it, for sure.
And I get really excited when people speak about the importance of small business, and it makes us all feel good. But let's give Leonard a big hand, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
You got your phone, huh?